Chapter 4. Amos woke before the others and wandered down to the water's edge. He scanned the river, looking for anything that might signal danger. It was a matter of life and death, his father had said, to see before you were seen. Sunlight bouncing off the water blinded him, and he squeezed his eyes half shut. Everyone in the family said he had the eyes of an eagle. It was true, he saw things that most people missed, but he believed it was because he spent so much time out of doors. Studying the animals and trees and birds, he had learned to recognize anything that was not as it should be. An odd movement, an alien sound, a color that did not fit. Upstream, where the river curved out of sight, there was a spot along the far shore, a puzzling shape in the water that he couldn't identify. Just to be safe, he sank to his knees and then parted the reeds for another look. He thought of the trick his Uncle Daniel had taught him when they hunted back home, a trick that helped narrow his vision to one small spot. Curling his hand into his fist, he peered with one eye through the spyglass tunnel between his fingers and his palm. Now he saw it clearly. It was a canoe gliding along in the murky shade, sometimes disappearing where a tree's heavy branches trailed in the water. Two men, one at each end of the canoe, paddled with smooth, cautious strokes, while two others rowed low in the center of the craft. Even at this distance, Amos could tell they were Indians. Amos edged backward until he reached Clara and Jonathan. They were still asleep, and more important, so was Queen Anne. If she should bawl out, the sound would be heard for miles. He crept back to the river and watched the canoe easing along the opposite shore. The Indians seemed as wary as he was about being seen. Amos wondered if they were some of the last night's attackers. He clenched his jaws tight and willed them onward. As they grew smaller with distance, he began to relax, sure that he hadn't been detected. When the trees on his side of the river obstructed his view, he returned to Clara and Jonathan. While he was slipping on his shirt, Clara stirred and sat up. He told her about the canoe. "Are they gone?" she asked. "Yes, but there'll probably be more," Amos said. "From now on, we better stay out of sight under the trees." Clara nodded and leaned over and nudged Jonathan. As he yawned and rubbed his eyes, she reached for her dry clothes. "We might as well start walking. We can get along a piece before dark." "Do you think we're doing the right thing going on to Marietta?" Amos asked. It scared him to think of leaving his father back there, but he'd do it, Clara said. He trusted her judgment more than his own. "Papa knew we were on the boat," Clara replied. "When he finds it gone, he'll think we took it, and he'll look for us downriver." She was probably right, Amos thought. If they walked along the riverbank, they were bound to get to Marietta sooner or later. He was beginning to understand how people in this territory used the Ohio River. Either they traveled it by boat, or they followed its broad, sunlit corridor through the forest. It not only served as a highway, it was also a familiar landmark that told people where they were. Even now, there might be someone nearby, friend or enemy, making his way through the trees and following the river. The thought sent a chill over Amos. "If the Indians were to capture us," he began. "I'm not worried about Indians," Clara said. "We got away from them last night, and I expect we could do it again." Looking at his sister, Amos couldn't help but smile. Nothing frightened her. She had a kind of blustering fearlessness that both thrilled and terrified him. A fellow couldn't tell what she might do. He sometimes thought that if they should meet a real woods wild Indian, Clara would probably march right up to him and declare she was taking him prisoner. Once they were all dressed, they headed downriver. Sunlight slanted over Amos's left shoulder at first, but as they moved into the trees, the light dimmed to a soft green glow. In the hushed quiet of the forest, they spoke in whispers. There was no underbrush, only moss-covered logs and feathery ferns and a spongy carpet of dead leaves. Black hardwood trunks soared into the dense, leafy umbrella that shut out the sun. His father had been right about the trees in Ohio. They were giants. Walking in the semi-darkness, it seemed to Amos the whole world had gone green. He longed for the sun, and his gaze turned often in the direction of the river. Occasional glimpses of light on the water made him breathe easier. The day was dying when the forest gave way to open sky. They squinted, half blind at the sight before them. Hundreds of fallen trees littered the ground, piled up in some places as high as houses. New trees had sprung up between the dead logs, but they were not yet mature enough to close out the sun. It must have taken a monstrous wind to do all that damage, Amos remarked. How are we going to get over these logs? Jonathan asked. Clara stood with an arm around the Jersey's neck. We can cut inland a ways, she suggested, then swing back to the river. But what if we can't find the river again? Jonathan protested. We're not going to be too far from it. Look, you can see the edge of the woods from here. Clara pointed away from the river to where a jumbled dead trees merged into the living forest. Jonathan's right. If we lose sight of the river, we'll be lost, Amos warned. Clara gazed at him a moment, her eyes clouded with thought. If you're worried about getting lost, I'll take Queen Anne and go around the logs, she said, while you two climb over them. You keep an eye on the river, Amos, and Jonathan can walk between us where he can see both you and me. Clara's plan sounded as if it would work, so Amos nodded agreement. When she went off with the cow in tow, he and Jonathan began their difficult crossing. As Amos struggled over and through the morass of rotting logs, his gaze swung like a pendulum from the river's sparkle to Jonathan's big hat and back to the river again. He couldn't see Clara, but he hoped Jonathan was keeping her in sight. By the time he reached the other side of the windfall, Amos was thirsty and wet with sweat. He leaned against a live tree waiting. Jonathan soon appeared. Then, Clara with Queen Anne plodding along behind. Let's stop here for the night, Clara said, sinking down to the ground. I'm hungry and tired, and I don't think I can walk any more. She started digging in her knapsack. It took only minutes for the three of them to finish off the last few strips of beef jerky. They washed it down with warm milk. There was plenty of that, and when they had had enough, Clara milked the rest out onto the ground. As a quiet twilight stole through the woods, Amos watched the river's half-hidden light change from red to pink to fading gray. He hoped the river would reflect the stars when they came out. As they were piling up leaves for a bed, they heard a faint rumble from the west. Sounds like we'll get rain before morning, Amos said with a sigh. There'd be no stars overhead or in the river. This big maple tree will keep us dry, Clara said. You remember the sugar tree in the corner of the yard back home? Remember how we used to climb up it and... I wish we were still there, Jonathan interrupted. Then, in a softer voice, he added, I wish Papa was here. Clara glanced at Amos and then back at Jonathan. Papa will find us, or else we'll find him in Marietta. We just have to get there. Amos's spirit sank as he thought of his father. Clara talked as if he was all right, but what if he had been wounded in the attack, or worse? Recalling the night raid on Wheeling, Amos relived the noise, the confusion, the dreaded sound of guns. Memories of Simon rose, then making the night come close and dark. He reached for the sack of marbles at his waist. Swallowing hard, he felt Simon's favorite agate shooter. These past months, the big green marble had been both a comfort and a curse. He had won it the day before the accident, meaning to keep it for a couple of days and then let Simon win it back. But before he thought of it again, Simon was dead. Several times he had considered throwing it away, but he just couldn't do it. Now it was like a hot coal that burned him whenever he held it. He let go of the marble pouch and lay down, hoping he wouldn't dream of Simon. The sound of splattering raindrops woke Amos, and seconds later the storm descended. He put his hands over his ears to soften the thunder's boom. Lightning forked across the sky, and in its bold light he saw Clara and Jonathan sitting upright, staring into the downpour. They had endured storms coming from Pennsylvania, sometimes remaining dry under the tree's thick foliage. But the maple tree they were sitting under was no match for this storm. They were soon soaked, and as night passed they huddled against Queen Anne, gathering both heat and cheer from her solid, warm bulk. Finally, the landscape took form in the pale light preceding sunrise, and the rain slowed to a quiet drizzle. "I wish we had a fire so we could get warm," Jonathan said, shivering. Clara rummaged in her knapsack for several moments and then turned to Amos. "Do you have flint and steel?" Amos shook his head. He had no need for fire-making tools on the trail because their father always carried flint and steel in his pocket. With a little dry tinder, he could have a fire going in a few minutes. "I'm hungry," Jonathan said. "Even if we could catch some game," Clara said, "we don't have a fire to cook it, and I'm certainly not going to eat raw meat." "But we've got plenty of milk," she added, pulling out her tin cup. They drank as much as they could hold while the patient Jersey cow nibbled at a mossy log. As they entered the woods again, Amos gazed back with longing at the windfall and the low clouds overhead. They might not stand under an open sky again for days. Rain worked through the high layered canopy and dripped on them. There was hardly a sound of their passing from the wet leaves. Jonathan was leading the way when he let out a yelp and fell backwards over a fallen log. Amos rushed forward, terrified that he had come face to face with a bear, or worse yet, Indians. Instead, he saw a startled tom turkey, feathers ruffled, wings fluttering. For a few seconds, the frightened bird stood his ground and then turned and fled, a blur of brown feathers along the forest floor. "I'd like to have him on a spit," Clara said. "Boy, I would too," said Amos. "Why didn't you grab him, Jonathan?" He grinned, knowing that capturing a wild turkey by hand was harder than catching a handful of smoke. Sometime later, they came across a tiny stream rippling toward the Ohio. As Queen Anne drank her fill, Clara followed the stream's course to the riverbank. Fed by some distant spring, the stream had created a sandbar that ran out through a shaded cove and into the river. But then the sun came out, bathing the sandbar in a warm yellow light. "Let's go down there," Clara said. "We can get our clothes dry." Without waiting for the boys, she led Queen Anne down the bank and out onto the sandy beach. The boys followed, pausing to study a five-toed animal track at the water's edge. While Clara and Jonathan chased minnows through the shallows, Amos wandered along the sunny sandbar. The bright, glittering water blinded him, but the sun's warmth was as comforting as a downy quilt on a winter's night. He watched a gathering of Carolina parakeets fluttering among the trees downstream. Their yellow and orange heads glared brightly against the foliage. If there were Indians about, he reasoned the birds would have squawked and taken flight. He relaxed a little and gazed across at the Virginia shore. Someone could be watching from those black shadows, but it was worth the risk to spend a few minutes in the sun. The sandbar reached out beyond the shoreline, and Amos walked to its very end to get a view of the whole river. As he gazed upstream, his breath caught in his throat. He could scarcely believe what he saw. There was a flatboat coming toward him, its new lumber bright against the gray water. "Clara, come quick, there's a boat," he called, never taking his eyes off the approaching craft. Clara and Jonathan ran over to him and stared with open mouths at the boat bearing down on them. It looked much like the ones they had traveled on, a frame of square timbers with a cabin in the middle and a livestock pen on the stern deck. There were people scattered around the boat, women sitting on crates and men studying the riverbanks. Children were playing on the cabin roof. "We're saved," Clara exclaimed. "They can't miss us. We won't have to walk to Marietta after all." Amos grinned at her, and they began hollering and waving their arms. A man on the boat's cabin pointed in their direction, and soon everyone on the boat was staring at them. "They've seen us," Amos announced. Now, with a certain knowledge of their rescue at hand, he wondered if there were Indians nearby who could have heard their shouts. Then he dismissed that worry. They would be on the boat in a few minutes and safe from danger on the shore. But as the boat came closer, Amos noticed several men huddling at the bow, talking and gesturing toward the sandbar. All of a sudden, the group scattered. Two men jumped to the oars while the other men, one by one, returned to the boat railing with rifles in their hands. Amos felt a cold pain in his stomach. He knew they weren't going to stop even before he saw the boat veering gently but surely away from the south shore. "No!" Clara's voice rose from a moan to a scream. "No, come get us! We're stranded here! Help us!" The people in the boat stood staring across the water like cold, unfeeling statues. She turned to Amos in disbelief. "They're not coming!" Amos shook his head, then gazed again at the receding boat. He had already figured out why they didn't stop. They were afraid. They had been warned that Indians sometimes use prisoners to lure a boat close to shore and then attack it. Though 3 children and a cow might look harmless enough, the people on the boat couldn't take the chance. The boat passed downriver and moments later floated around the bend and out of sight. Clara bent down and picked up a handful of stones and hurled them with all their might out into the river. "There was plenty of room for us. They're mean, and don't they have any feelings?" "What are we going to do now, sister?" Jonathan asked, his voice cracking. For once, Clara had no ready response. Amos stared at the spot where the boat had disappeared. It was no use hoping for rescue now. If other boats came downriver, none of them would stop either. "We won't find any help on this side of the river either," Amos thought. "The people here are Indians." The thought of Indians stirred him to action. "Come on, guys, we've got to get away from the river," he said. "What are you talking about?" Clara countered, her eyes still blazing with anger. "Indians," Amos replied. "They may have heard us. We've got to get back into the trees." He forgot for the moment that he'd never told Clara what to do, but he remembered his father's warning. There are always Indians. He scrambled up the bank and into the refuge of the forest. Clara glanced once more at the bend of the river, then followed him without any further mention of the flatboat. It had entered and exited their lives so quickly that it seemed to have been only a dream. Ooh-wee!